People have read the book, Just Mercy. How many people have seen the movie? Okay, great. I hope that's doubled next week. One of my all-time favorite books is, movies. One of my all-time favorite movies is To Kill a Mockingbird, with Atticus Finch, the character who's the brave lawyer, moral hero who defends a falsely accused African-American man named Tom Robinson in a southern town. And when I've discussed this film in the past, I've emphasized the great acting of Gregory Peck, the very compelling and realistic acting of the child actors in it, the brilliant cinematography, the underemphasized but incredibly effective musical score, and of course, racism, which is at the heart of the book. Now, Harper Lee inspired the film, To Kill a Mockingbird, when she wrote her book, but I've recognized how the film promotes an all too common white savior narrative that we see quite often, where grateful black people are thankful to the white hero coming to the rescue. But Bryan Stevenson, who wrote Just Mercy, points out a often overlooked element of the book. He talks about when he visited the town where To Kill a Mockingbird was set, Monroeville, Alabama. And it was the heart of Dixie. He was working long hours there to defend the right of poor people who did not have representation, and they were trapped in the criminal justice system. And locals told Stevenson that he had to visit the Monroe County Heritage Museum, which highlighted Harper Lee's work, her life there, the book and the film, and of course the great moral character of Atticus Finch. But Stevenson points out a part of the story that I said is often left out. The ultimate fate of the unjustly accused black man, Tom Robinson. Before the trial, Tom was gripped by fear of retribution from a system that would crush anybody challenging white supremacy in Alabama. But he gets up the courage to testify on the stand, he tells the truth, but he's still found guilty. Now, while perhaps he might have received mercy through an appeals process, this doesn't occur because even before he's brought to prison, he is lynched. He is shot 17 times in the back. But that's something that many of us prefer leaving out because we like to celebrate heroes rather than mourning victims. We speak of the civil rights movement as an example, as a great success, which in some ways it was. But Stevenson was reminded that sometimes our tendency to overlook our setbacks came to mind when he met Rosa Parks in Alabama. He met her a number of times, and he talked about this poster child of the Montgomery bus boycott, and we love telling this celebratory tale of the woman who was too tired to move to the back of the bus. But that story doesn't include an untold part of the full story, because Stevenson explains that what most people don't know is, quote, after the boycott was declared officially over and black people were sitting on the buses, there was unbelievable violence. There were 12 people who were shot standing waiting for buses. We had white people going around Montgomery County shooting black people who dared to get on the buses, end quote. How many people knew that? I didn't. I taught the Montgomery bus boycott in a history class for 20 years, and I never taught that. I didn't know about it. So ignoring that, even though I didn't mean to, didn't cost me anything. But for people who are activists, for people, particularly activists of color, not knowing something like that could cost them their lives. Because the reality is that survival for many activists means never letting your guard down. Because in seeking racial justice, there are a few totally happy endings and the work just continues. And this is why Stevenson got so frustrated at public officials who would jump on the bandwagon after he spent months trying to free somebody who was unjustly accused and put on death row, and then he'd get this person out, and at the press conference, finally the politicians would show up and they'd smile and say, "See, the system works." But Stevenson realized that the system really works to break people who are powerless. He writes, "To crush those amongst us whose brokenness is the most viable." And for every person that Stevenson saved, there were dozens and dozens of other people who were innocent, but they were young, maybe mentally impaired, without legal defense, who unjustly suffered and still suffer behind bars. So Stevenson and his Equal Justice Initiative, an organization he founded, can celebrate some successes. In 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that mandatory sentences of life without parole for people sentenced as children under the age of 17 were unconstitutional. So that's a victory. And in 2016, they applied that ruling retroactively, which freed 2,300 young people being held behind bars for life without parole. And this year, as of this year, 166 people have been saved from execution thanks to the work of Bryan Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative. But we all know that the prison industrial complex churns on, over-policing, underfunding of public defenders, the private prisons that make great profits, all devastate poor communities across this country. Between 1972 and 2012, the number of incarcerated people has grown from 300,000 to 2.3 million. Our land of liberty has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Well-paid correctional institution lobbyists are effective. Between the 15 years from 1900 to 2005, one new prison was built in this country every 10 days. This is a growth industry, even today. We've had some recent success scaling it back. Now, I want you to read this book. I want you to see the film, so I'm not going to tell you much about the main story of Walter McMillian, the man who was unjustly accused in Alabama. But I will tell you some of the things that Bryan Stevenson shared about how cruel our system is and how it breaks so many people who are poor, female, black, young, mentally ill, people without resources. And I'll share a little bit near the end about anger and revenge and brutality that drive this system and the brokenness that is involved and is curiously an empowering aspect of Stevenson's work. That's the most important piece that I've taken away from this. And I hope it inspires all of us to be a bit more active in advocating for reform over punishment, for redemption over revenge. A little biography. Stevenson was born in 1959 in Milton, Delaware, a town the same latitude as Washington, D.C., but with a lot of Southern traditions and feel. And he grew up personally realizing the omnipresence of racism. He was frustrated with the segregation that kept him out of certain public facilities and forced him to go to certain schools. He recalled having to wait for polio vaccination until all the white children were done. And then he and the other black kids remember being harshly treated by the nurses, who were simply tired after a full day of inoculations to children, and so they treated them with sort of a rough and caustic attitude, and that stuck in his head. His strong academic efforts, however, brought him to Eastern University and then Harvard Law School. But he found his calling when he went to Atlanta for a Southern Prisoners Defense Committee internship. And soon after that, he moved to Montgomery, Alabama, and founded the Equal Justice Initiative. He worked nearly constantly for the accused and imprisoned who didn't have legal representation. And he realized that this client-by-client relationship saved many individuals, but he also understood that systemic change had to be made. So he served on President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. He worked with the Black Lives Movement, and then he branched out fully into education, public education, by founding the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And those institutions teach us about the evolving nature of racism, how it went from enslavement to Jim Crow to lynching to mass incarceration. So I'm going to focus a bit on mass incarceration today, and I'm going to focus on the overlap of things like race and poverty and age and mental disability. So let me start talking about Alabama. Now for Stevenson, he saw racism as front and center in Alabama. Judges are elected in Alabama and they campaign on the Tough on Crime platform. And those who are being treated toughly are overwhelmingly poor and black or both. And the white dominance in the criminal justice system is pretty complete. A couple of years ago, this was a statistic from about 4 years ago, 41 of the state's 42 district attorneys were white. Blacks were regularly prevented from serving on juries, And Stevenson wrote that, quote, nearly everyone on death row has been tried by an all-white or nearly all-white jury. And if by chance there is an appeal, 19 appellate judges, all of them who review death sentences, are white Republicans, including all of the justices of the state Supreme Court. So it's no surprise in a state that celebrates Confederate Memorial Day, it doesn't have a King Day, it has a King Lee Day that ties together the Nobel Prize winner with one of the South's most revered generals. And Stevenson notes that as advancements in racial justice occurred during the Civil Rights Movement, more and more Confederate monuments began to pop up in reaction to that. And more flags of the Confederacy began to come out to celebrate Jefferson Davis Day, another state holiday in Alabama. And he understands that, quote, we have a long history of seeing people through the lens of racial difference. It's a direct line from slavery to the treatment of black suspects today, and we need to acknowledge this. He says this history leads many white Americans to see black people as threats. Stevenson explains, our society applies a presumption of dangerousness and guilt to young black men, and that's what leads to wrongful arrests and wrongful convictions and wrongful death sentences, not just wrongful shootings. And he cites a startling statistic that I did not have time to verify, because I can't believe it's true. He said, quote, 1 in every 3 black male babies born in this century is expected to be incarcerated. So the roots of this racism run deep. Now, Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative office is a few hundred yards from an old Montgomery slave market. And where his warehouse was built is where the place where the slaves were chained before they were brought to the auction house. And he suggested to folks in Montgomery that they put up some plaques marking this history, but the Alabama Department of Archives and History said they wanted to avoid, quote, the potential controversy. Poverty. That's a huge part of it too. Puts people at a disadvantage, especially in Alabama. It's a very poor state to begin with. But also in the 1990s, federal funding for death penalty public defenders was cut by reactionary conservatives that took over Congress. In 1995, Alabama was the only state that did not provide legal assistance to people on death row. That might suggest why it has the highest per capita rate of death penalty sentencing in the country. Alabama taught Stevenson what he teaches others. Our criminal justice system treats you better if you are rich and guilty than if you are poor and innocent. Stephen Bright, the director of Atlanta's Southern Prisoner Defense Committee, where Stevenson first intern, agreed. He said, capital punishment means them without the capital get the punishment. Unfortunately, that's generally true in the North as well as in the South. Nearly every person the Equal Justice Initiative works with has the economic deck stacked against them from the start. Unemployment, unexpected expenses, puts people into desperate situations. And in this land of opportunity, many people do not have such opportunity. Stevenson says, we will ultimately not be judged by our technology or our design. We will be judged by the character of how our society treats the poor. That's when we'll understand truly profound things about who we are. And poverty hits particularly hard at women, often confined to low-paying service jobs and often left to raise children by themselves. Stevenson gives one example. He says, one of the first incarcerated women I ever met was a young mother who was serving a long prison sentence for writing checks to buy her 3 children Christmas presents without sufficient funds in her account. And he says it struck him like a Victor Hugo novel. 5 bad checks, none of them for more than $150, ripped this mother away from her children. Something that I could just pull out my check and write it for her today. But she was in jail away from her children for this. And thousands of struggling women in similar positions are punished for minor crimes. 2/3 of the women in prison, nearly 2/3, are there for low-level drug or property crimes. And we have a 3 strikes rule that locks people in, even when judges try to make exceptions. There's also the growth of what's known as child chemical endangerment statutes, which can result in the arrest of women who often, whether it's due to ignorance or addiction, take certain chemicals while they're pregnant. And those who are merely undernourished but have miscarriages can also be punished. Stevenson notes that the media loves sensationalizing killer mothers. And all this has led to an increase of 646% in the number of women sent to prison between 1980 and 2010. And some women's prisons are simply barbaric. Not all, but the Tutwiler prison in Alabama was noted by Mother Jones as one of the 10 worst prisons in the country. Male guards can freely roam, or used to until the expose, freely roam the bathrooms and the showers. They made crude comments. They sexually attacked and even raped some of the inmates without any repercussions. 70 to 85% of the women in prisons are left minor children on the outside. When released from prisons, mothers can no longer get food stamps by new laws. They can't get public housing, so they can't even live with their children. So we've created this caste of what Stevenson calls untouchables. Children. From the 1980s on, politicians like Bill Clinton and public figures like Donald Trump peddled super predator myths about adolescence, leading to a hysterical overreaction and a demand for mandatory sentences with children. And it goes against all common sense. Stevenson says that we know that children are impulsive, that they don't have self-regulatory systems that are developed. And he says, it seems odd to have to explain in a court of law something so fundamental about childhood. Why is it that we treat young people so differently by prohibiting them from driving, drinking, owning guns, voting? And yet we treat them like adults in the criminal justice system. He says, simultaneously, we treat some of the most at-risk, neglected, and impaired children exactly the same as full-grown adults in the criminal justice system. Again, we are the only country in the world that condemns children to life without parole. 3,000 children today suffer that fate. They're now many adults. Ian was one that he talks about, who had an incompetent public defender and was sentenced when he was 13, and because the prison he was sent to didn't have a children's facility, he was placed in solitary confinement for 18 consecutive years. Race is often involved. Florida, 2010, more than 100 children were condemned to life without parole, and all of the children between the ages of 13 to 14, the youngest, were Black or Latino. And Stevenson points out that those who grow from boys to men behind bars look back at their adolescence as many as we do. We look back at ourselves as almost different people, impulsive, prone to mistakes. He writes, almost all of the cases involved condemned people marked by the tragic irony that they were now nothing like the confused children who had committed a violent crime. They had all changed in some significant way. I think the most tragic personal stories that he talks about in the book, which are not even a big part of the movie, are about those people with mental disabilities. In the 1960s through the Reagan years, states were just taking people out of institutions and putting them out on the street without any support. And obviously, at that time, you suddenly had a rise in incarceration rates of people with mental disabilities. 95% in some states of the people who were in an institution in the 1980s were out by 2000. Stevenson laments, prisons have become warehouses for the mentally ill. He estimates that 50% of the people in prisons have a diagnosed mental illness, and 20% suffer from serious mental illnesses. And they're thrown into overcrowded and violent prisons that only make their conditions worse, and then they're punished when their symptoms break out, like if they start to yell or if they have delusions and make a fuss. And case after case demonstrates our collective incompetence to deal appropriately with mental disabilities. Now, I'm blaming me because I pay for these prisons. It's my money that has these things happening. Victoria Banks, I'm going to give you 4 examples. Mentally disabled, sent to prison, supposedly for the murder of an infant born prematurely. They couldn't find the baby, they charged her with murder. Didn't have the body. Only later did it find out that she had her tubes tied. She couldn't have had a baby. It was tied 5 years earlier. She made up the pregnancy because of her mental illness to a degree. George Daniels had a brain injury due to a traffic accident. He had delusions. He acted erratically, going into people's homes. His public defenders spent most of the time arguing about who was going to get the fees. And there was a Dr. Sager who diagnosed in court that George did not have a mental illness, that he was faking things. And it found out later that Sager was not an MD, he was a fraud. And this happens more than we realize. Poor expert testimony often condemns those who need psychological help. Like Mr. Jenkins, when he was a child, his father was murdered, his mother died of an overdose, he was passed around to 9 different foster homes. Some of them probably were loving and good, but the last foster home he had, his parents took him out to the woods, tied him to a tree, where he was found 3 days later by hunters. And his trauma inevitably contributed to his erratic behavior and eventual arrest. Joe Sullivan, who the state itself said suffered a childhood of abuse and chaos, end quote. He was tried in court for a sexual assault at the age of 13. He had been in 10 different foster homes in 3 years, but he was found guilty even though the state destroyed the semen and the blood samples that could have proved that he was innocent. So what awaits these poor, young, mentally ill victims of our retributive system? Some reforms have been made and not all prisons are the same, but brutality remains the central dominant reality. Prior to the 1971 Attica uprising, there were such things as hitching posts or cattle prods or something called a sweat box where prisoners were put in for days and weeks at a time, the size of a casket. And these horrors were generally eliminated over time, but as they were eliminated, solitary confinement went up because they were still looking for a way to punish the people in jail further. It became common. Stevenson writes about the Apalachee Correctional Facility in Florida, where traumatized solitary prisoners are given more time alone should they complain or shout or scream or even should they harm themselves. They're given more time. And maybe the cruelest toll is paid by those on death row, which often involves the most restrictive form of solitary punishment, left alone in their cells for 23 hours a day, often in close proximity to the electric chair. And in Alabama, Stevenson writes about how sometimes, especially in the summer, 100-degree cells, humid, the prisoners spend their time catching spiders and snakes and rats while contemplating their execution date. Now, I'm going to spare you any of the details about electrocution, you can imagine, but Stevenson's correct when he says, quote, abstractions about capital punishment were one thing, but the details of systematically killing someone who is not a threat are completely different. And some prison officials now talk about lethal injection as somehow civilizing our killing. But Stevenson points out that some drugs in some states have been banned for animal euthanasia because they, quote, cause a painful and torturous death. So this barbarism of our system is fueled by a vicious cycle of retribution and revenge, whipped up by politicians and the media. 50 years ago, he talks about the fact that violent crimes, capital cases in particular, were considered a harm to the general public, and that prosecution and punishment was a sober civic responsibility, done in as compassionate and objective way as possible. In the 1980s, we began personalizing crime victims. There may be some good reasons for that, but there were special victims' right groups, and victim impact statements began to increase. Now, these were previously banned by the courts because they had a strong emotional effect on the process. These victim impact statements began to sway judges and juries towards harsher and harsher sentencing. And millions of dollars are funded crime victim advocacy groups. Measures like Megan's Law, which meant that more rights for victims, but also more severe punishment for sex offenders. And some states made more accommodation to the families of crime victims in capital cases by making the rooms for observing execution bigger, so more people could fit in them. So our system more readily demonizes people who, in their worst moments, do bad things. But Stevenson bemoans this creation of a caste system. He says, we've institutionalized policies that reduce people to their worst acts and permanently label them criminal, murderer, rapist, thief, drug dealer, sex offender, felon, identities they cannot change. One phrase that was so uplifting that Stevenson uses all the time, he says, you are better than the worst thing you've done. You are better than the worst thing you've done. And my heart breaks for victims of violent crime and their friends and their family, but I don't believe in the long run we can heal through revenge. Stevenson says that fear and anger are a threat to justice. They can infect a community, a state, a nation, and make us blind, irrational, and dangerous. So he's dedicated his life to, quote, battling the injustice we create when we allow fear, anger, and distance to shape the way we treat the most vulnerable amongst us. And we are all victims of that. I am. When Stevenson was 16, his grandfather was murdered in a break-in here in Philadelphia. The killers received life sentences, but Stevenson wrote that he didn't feel a desire for revenge. He didn't necessarily want to see the perpetrators punished. The values of his upbringing led him to prefer healing to hurting. He writes in this book, "I came from a world where we valued redemption over revenge." What a wonderful world he was in as a child. He understood that our system traumatizes not just the accused and their families as well, and the communities of the accused and their children, and even the victims of crime. He knew that those who were innocent but accused and in jail were broken. They suffered through the imprisonment, and their community suffered through the imprisonment and years of efforts to try to free innocent people. But being broken isn't the end of the story for Stevenson. So I hope this brings us up a little bit. Because what is so remarkable is that he is so open to the suffering of others. He says that his life is full of brokenness. In the system, in his clients, in himself. He writes, "You can't effectively fight abuse of power, poverty, inequality, illness, oppression, and injustice and not be broken by it." He continues, "Is there an emotional cost? Is there some toll connected to being proximate to all this suffering? I think that's when I realized that my motivation to help condemned people, it's not like I'm some whole person trying to help the broken people that I see along the road. I am broken by the injustice I see." And what makes him so remarkable is that he transforms his own brokenness into conviction and strength. He mentions the spiritual writer Thomas Merton, who wrote, "As long as we are on the earth, the love that unites us will bring us suffering by our very contact with one another. Because there is love. Because this love is the resetting of a body of broken bones. Even saints cannot live with other saints on this earth without some anguish, without some pain at the differences that come between them." Brokenness for Stevenson is part and parcel of the healing and the redemption he generates. I mean, we're all flawed and failed, but the realization of that helps us love. He writes, "Our shared vulnerability and imperfection nurtures and sustains our capacity for compassion." When he was young, he was struck by how much love and closeness were intertwined with fragility. His grandmother was deeply affected by the broken bones and the broken families that is slavery's legacy, always told him to keep close. Keep close. He said, "When I visited her, she would hug me so tightly I could barely breathe." In law school, he felt lost because he was away from his family, and that moved him towards justice work. He said, "The distance I experienced in my first year in law school made me feel lost. Proximity to the condemned, to people unfairly judged, that was what guided me back to something that felt like home." Wow. Proximity and close relationship are a part of who he is. Barry Scheck, who's the co-founder of the Innocence Project, said, "Brian is without question the most inspirational lawyer of our times, not just because he's charismatic and also a brilliant litigator, but because he connects emotionally with people like no one else." Now, to do that amongst so much brokenness, so much pain, is amazing to me. Most of us, when confronted with pain, retreat to more comfortable places. I mean, I know I do all the time. So how is it that Stevenson could be so close to such pain and abuse and injustice, but keep his eyes on the prize and grow stronger? If you don't know him, listen to him speak. There's such compassion. In his epilogue, he writes that all those who suffered with and through people who were imprisoned unjustly. He says, if the anguish of all the menaced spaces of Monroe County, where Walter McMillan was sentenced, could be gathered in some carefully constructed receptacle, it could power something extraordinary, operate as some astonishing alternative fuel capable of previously impossible action. For him, suffering and pain can be transformed into power and liberation. He says there is a strength, a power even, in understanding brokenness. It creates a need and a desire for mercy. Connecting with others in a broken world offers us a chance to be whole. He says there is no wholeness outside of our reciprocal humanity. So I urge you to read this book. Tell your friends about it. See the movie. And then transform the suffering they portray into positive energy directed at criminal justice reform. We have an opportunity in this city with a district attorney who's committed to this. But for too long, we've treated this work, anti-oppression work, anti-racism work, as merely a form of penance. But Stevenson writes, I'm not interested in punishing America for this history. I want to liberate America. For me personally, it's much more than even that. It's about being fully alive in the work of healing a broken world. There's too much suffering to wallow in guilt or to escape into complacency. It's time for us all to be free, and I thank Bryan Stevenson for showing us a way. Thank you.